All right. Why don't we get underway? I suspect that some will continue to join, but I think we should get underway. So good morning and welcome. My name is Mark Balwa. I'm with the Intersol Group, and I'm the facilitator who's worked with the steering committee and the industry working group to develop the proposed code that I'll be presenting to you today. So the purpose of this webinar is to present the proposed grocery industry code of conduct, the code, and it will be a general overview of that. I will not be going into substantive detail on the code provisions and the governance structure. I'll be giving you a general overview. And it's important to note that the consultation website has the consultation document and has all of that detail there. So the objectives today is to provide that general or develop a general awareness and understanding of the proposed code, to develop a general understanding of the consultation process and how industry stakeholders can participate in that process, and to explain the steps that will be taken to finalize the code. All right. So those three objectives. So by way of a bit of background, we're in our third year now since the agriculture ministers were asked to intervene, and about 18 months worth of work of the steering committee. Again, just to provide some context, in July of 2021, FBT ministers called for an industry-led process to develop a code of conduct. Government co-leads, and these are co-leads of a working group within government, met with industry representatives shortly thereafter, and Intersol, that's our firm, was retained as the facilitator for the code development. Soon after that, a group of 10 multi-stakeholder industry representatives was convened to address the ministerial request and engaged in an intensive program of weekly meetings to develop first the terms of reference for their work, a work plan for development of the code, a dispute resolution mechanism, and an implementation framework, including this consultation process. And as well, the code itself. And you'll see that as I go through that, the code has several elements to it. So here are the organizations that are represented on the steering committee or were represented. So you'll see that we've switched one out. So this is the current, the current list would exclude Food and Beverage Canada, but would include CETAC. Now, the stakeholders were selected. So the stakeholders in terms of those represented here were selected to reflect the entire supply chain from growers to retailers and to represent the various groupings of primary agriculture, manufacturers, processors, distributors, and retailers. So we really wanted to have the full gamut across the spectrum. Now, these are the current steering committee members, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. I suspect that many of them are known to you, but I did want you to put names to faces as well. So I'm going to ask our co-chairs to introduce themselves first, and I'll start with Diane Brisebois. If you would go ahead, Diane.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. My name is Diane Brisebois. I'm the president and CEO of Retail Council of Canada, Conseil canadien du commerce de détail, and the association represents mid and large grocers within its membership. And RCC has been involved in the steering committee since its inception. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Diane.
Michael Graydon. I'm the CEO of Food, Health and Consumer Products of Canada, and along with Deanne, the co-chair of the steering committee.
Now I'll go alphabetical from here. Denise Allen is with the Food Producers of Canada. Unfortunately, something came up at the last minute, so she will not be on with us this morning. Next would be Mathieu Frigon.
Mathieu Frigon, I'm the CEO of the Dairy Processors Association of Canada.
Thank you. Then Rebecca Lee.
Good morning. I'm Rebecca Lee, the Executive Director of the Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada, Producteurs des Fruits et Légumes du Canada.
Thank you, Rebecca. I don't believe Ron Lemire is with us this morning. He's traveling. And Ron is the CEO of the Canadian Produce Marketing Association. Stephanie Levasseur, I think, was going to try to join us, but she had a conflict as well.
Here.
Stephanie? Oh, there we are.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stéphanie Levasseur, an apple grower from Quebec. I'm the second vice president of Union des producteurs agricoles du Québec and represent about 48,000 members, growers in Quebec.
Merci, Stéphanie. Sylvie Cloutier, are you there? I should mention that Sylvie Cloutier is with the Conseil de la Transformation Alimentaire du Québec, and she joined the committee to replace Kathleen Sullivan with Food and Beverage Canada. And Sylvie's has a dual role. On the one hand, she represents the voice of SMEs and in Quebec in particular, but also on the other hand, she works to keep the other provincial food and beverage associations informed of progress. And then Scott Ross, I'm not sure if Scott is able to say it because I think he's chairing another meeting at the same time. So Scott Ross is the with the Canadian Federation of Agriculture.
He's on, Mark. He's just
Oh.
he's not off mute.
Okay, Scott. He may not be able to unmute himself because he's in the other meeting. And then Gary Sands, if you would introduce yourself, Gary.
Hi, excuse me, I'm Gary Sands, Senior Vice President with the Canadian Federation of Independent Grocers, and just delighted to have everyone on this call today to share our work.
Thank you, Gary. So that's your steering committee. Now, you'll hear later that there are also industry working groups, and so I'll talk about those a little bit later as well. And I understand that some of those industry working group members are on the call today as well. So again, by way of additional context, we consulted several, or I should say the steering committee met on a weekly basis, as mentioned before, and reviewed several model codes, including Australia, the UK, the payments code. And it's important to note that the review is not a paper exercise. The steering committee actually met with representatives from Australia, the UK, and the finance department to develop a clear understanding of the codes, their advantages and shortcomings. The steering committee then had in-depth discussions on the type of code Canada should adopt and the overall principles it should live up to. The former UK adjudicator was also retained to provide input. And then a large cross-industry working group was established to bring on-the-ground experience and to provide insights that took into consideration, first, the unique nature of industry in Canada, the distinctive legislative framework that we have, and the elements advanced that were important to stakeholders, such as reciprocity. And this group met regularly from April to May 2022. I'm talking the industry group now. Subsequently, a subset of industry working group was established, and it met frequently to determine the trade rule provisions, which were then reviewed by the steering committee. So just to be clear, steering committee, industry working group, and then a subgroup of the industry working group with on-the-ground experience. The steering committee consulted widely with its own board members and or internal working groups throughout the year, and webinars were provided to review the work in progress to seek input on the co-provision. So again, the steering committee had their own either board members or advisory groups that they continued to interact with to make sure that they were on the right track. In tandem with the above, the steering committee began its work on the development of a governance and enforcement framework, which includes an adjudication and dispute resolution mechanism, which also includes mediation and arbitration models, enforcement mechanisms, and an organizational structure. The governance and enforcement framework was also fully reviewed and discussed with the industry sub-working group. So again, what we've got here, it represents the sum total of their work. So the steering committee established the proposed framework based on the following premises. One, a single national code of conduct. We wanted to avoid a situation where each province or territory establishes their own rules, which could differ and create barriers to the free flow of trade. Second, an inclusive and reciprocal, in other words, supplier, retailer, primary processor, so reciprocal across the group, where the rules apply equally to both parties to an agreement. So for this reason, you'll see in the language of the code, it typically speaks to parties to an agreement as opposed to retailer or supplier. I mean, unless it's necessary, it's always parties to an agreement. Again, another premise was mandatory participation. Now, the reality is that the code is voluntary. There is no legal framework we could find that would make participation in the code mandatory. But it's clear for this to work, it'll require the participation of a wide breadth of the industry. And we're confident that the guidance provided in the provisions of the proposed code that's been developed by industry will be embraced and adhered to by that same industry. Next, it requires an effective adjudication and dispute resolution process. Finally, a principle-based code. In other words, it's non-prescriptive. So the provisions, as I say, are non-prescriptive. Other codes are more prescriptive in the way they've been written. And in our case, we've used, clearly there are provisions, but as I say, they are much more principle-based and less codified, so to speak. We've also involved legal counsel throughout the process and consulted with the Competition Bureau as well. The proposed code has received a favorable review from independent legal counsel. And the next step is the assessment of the code from the Competition Bureau, and we made that request of them. Now, I mentioned earlier the sub-working group, industry sub-working group. So these are the members of the industry sub-working group who came together to undertake the difficult task of negotiating the code provisions and the governance and adjudication framework that would be acceptable to the stakeholder groups that they represented, while at the same time responding to the needs and interests of the stakeholders across the table from them. So it was truly a negotiated solution, but a collaborative effort to get to that negotiated solution. So again, if you look at the list, Doug Nathanson with Sobeys, Errol Serrett from the Food, Health and Consumer Products Association, Giancarlo Cimarci, president of Vince's Market, Luc Perevaux, with VegPro International, Mark Taylor with Lactalis Canada, Patrice Léger-Bourgoin, General Manager of APMQ, Serge Boulanger from Metro, Ted Lawson with Norterra and formerly Bonduel, and Ted has since resigned, but James Crosby with Crosby Molasses Company has picked up Ted's position. So once again, I think a good reflection of the breadth of the industry there as well in the sub-working group. So the outcome of all of this work is a code of conduct that's not a singular document. And I want to emphasize this point. It's a set of integrated measures, including principles, and you'll see that at the center of that triangle. Trade rule provisions supported by clear definitions. And I should mention that the definitions are still a work in progress. We have a set of definitions, but they still need to be finalized. An adjudication and dispute resolution mechanism, which starts with a requirement that the parties attempt to resolve the dispute on their own, to coaching and mediation services from the office of the adjudicator, to, if required, external third-party resolution, as well as enforcement mechanisms. These all work together to promote fair and ethical trading and contractual certainty. And finally, as mentioned previously, the code only works with the participation of a wide breadth of industry. So that's why you see that on the left-hand side of that triangle. So if you think of this as maybe a three-legged stool, so I've got a triangle, call it a three-legged stool. If one leg is removed, it won't stand up. So again, trade rules, adjudication process, dispute resolution, and industry participation. Take any one of those away and it falls over. So they need to work together. So just to summarize, the framework for the code provisions is design is based on a code creation team comprised of 10 associations and a negotiated outcome between retailers, suppliers, and again, that was at the, in terms of that negotiated solution with the sub-working group, industry sub-working group. It's a non-prescriptive code. Needed to pass the SME test. It's not designed to prohibit policies, to guarantee stock or shelf level or scale, or ensure buying power or prevent buying power or prevent tough negotiations. And it was designed to capture the key issues in Canada while leveraging solutions globally. So our issues here are similar, but not always the same as what we saw elsewhere. But we were informed by what's going on elsewhere in the world. So the next few slides are designed to provide a very brief and general overview of the code provisions. So we don't have time to go through each provision in detail. We've done that in the past with the advisory groups for the steering committee members. It took over an hour to get through the code provisions. They can be found in the consultation document on the consultation website. So you will, and I will give you directions to that. And I encourage you to review them in detail prior to providing feedback on the proposed code. All right. So they are all there in detail, and that's where you're going to find the detail necessary to understand the code in more detail and depth. So the code provisions. Section 1 speaks to fair and ethical dealing, no punitive or vexatious acts. And within that, it requires you to negotiate in good faith and undertake fair and ethical dealing, to negotiate and conclude agreements through mutual consent. Parties to the code may not alter contracts unilaterally. And as mentioned in the title of this, no punitive or vexatious acts, no reprisals is what it's speaking to. So that's in section 1. Section 2 speaks to commercial agreements. And there's a strong recommendation there to create agreements, have them in writing, and to cover all terms and conditions that you want covered in your agreement. And there is guidance in terms of what should be covered in an agreement as well. In that section, it speaks to you cannot avoid or refuse entering into a commercial agreement. So that's again, parties to the code. So neither side. The agreement can include contracts, invoices, purchase orders, bills of lading, email, or other mutually agreed material. In other words, when we say we strongly encourage agreements, we're not saying it has to be a formal contract, 10 or 20 or 30 pages. It's up to you to determine what's acceptable in terms of that contract. So it's quite flexible in that regard. You also cannot design an agreement to explicitly work around or willfully disregard the provisions of the code, and no party may waive any of its rights or obligations under the code. So you can't be forced to say, well, I'm going to give up my rights. And as mentioned, there are examples of critical program elements that should be included in your agreements. The third section is on payments. And here there are a number of elements. And by the way, I'm going to come back to a few key elements a little bit later in the presentation, because I think there are a few here. While there are many, and you'll see many code provisions, there are a few that I think are critical in terms of moving forward. So on the payments, it covers timing of payments. It covers payments for programs that are defined in an agreement, and these are many of the programs that are part of your normal course of business. So stocking, listing, positioning, programs, promotions, marketing cost, unsellables, shrinkage. So and you may call them different things, but there are a whole host of programs that are covered. There are also the ad hoc payments for non-compliance with the terms of an agreement. So you can read fines here, as it's kind of commonly known as. So that's covered in there as well. Payments as a result of audits, payments for price matching, and payments for consumer complaints. So these were the elements that were included under Section 3. There are also other items. So under other items, it includes changes to supply chain procedures, tying of third-party goods and services, good faith forecasting, ordering, and allocation of supply, and I'll come back to that one a little bit later. Guidelines relating to cost changes, duties in relation to delisting or supplying, protection of confidential information and respecting intellectual property, and in exceptional circumstances and force majeure. So those are all under Section 4. And then there's a duty to participate and inform staff in Section 5, and the dispute resolution. And I will talk more about the dispute resolution piece under the governance section. Sorry, that was the last slide there. So I'd like to move next to the proposed governance and code adjudication section. And here, the proposal is for the Grocery Code Adjudicator Office, sort of the GCAO, if you will, to be a private membership-based organization incorporated under the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. We're proposing that the membership in the GCAO will be voluntary, as mentioned earlier. So we're proposing that the GCAO's primary source of funding will be annual membership dues collected from members, and proposing 6 categories of members in the GCAO. So you can see those in that graphic. Hopefully it may not be quite large enough for you to see, but you can see in there you've got category A, primary producers selling directly to distributors, wholesalers, and retailers. Category B would be manufacturers and suppliers. Category C, manufacturers, they were the SME, manufacturers and suppliers, and then category C, large manufacturers and suppliers. The next category would be category D, wholesalers and distributors, category E, independent retailers, and category F, large retailers. Now, the steering committee is working to identify funding models that'll provide adequate resources for the essential functions of the GCAO while ensuring they're not overly burdensome on any party to the code. A contribution grant from governments is also being sought to set up the office in its first year of operations before the office welcomes its first members. The steering committee believes that for specific services like formal arbitration costs should be borne by the parties in question as deemed reasonable and appropriate. Now you can see there as well the board composition. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Just want to make sure I've actually got that covered in my notes here. Yeah, I've got it. I'll come back to that in just a moment. So the operating principles of the office. So fundamentally, the role of the adjudicator will be to uphold the objectives and principles set out in the code. And you'll see when you go to the consultation website, the objectives are front and center, as are the principles. So the office will function under the operational principles of objectivity, efficiency, being proactive, and having a light touch. So if I go through these individually, objectivity and procedural fairness will guide the GCAO in all its actions. The office will start from the assumption that no one wants to or intends to work in contravention of the code and possibly face sanctions and or end up in arbitration. Efficiency, code exists to support business and to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the grocery sector. The industry is fast moving, so speed in achieving code compliance and issue resolution is essential. We don't want to slow down the speed of business. Proactive, so again, the office will proactively identify issues, and clarifying their status over the code for the benefit of the entire industry will be key in limiting the number of formal disputes between members. So again, it's taking a proactive approach to address issues as they begin to arise. And a light touch. Retailers and suppliers are readily capable of solving issues themselves if the code is clear and they understand it. By highlighting and encouraging good practices while shining a light on and discouraging poor practices, the adjudicator will drive positive behavior change. All right. Now I'm going to go to the board composition. The GCAO board will include a total of 12 directors elected by members and one non-voting FPT government representative as an observer. All 12 directors will be elected for a 2-year term and eligible for up to 6 consecutive years on the board. And the expectation is that we will stagger the terms so that we never have a majority of the board switching over at any given point in time. The proposal is to have the current steering committee take on board duties on an interim basis until the GCAO is operational. In other words, we need to get the office up and running. So the easiest way to do that is to start with the existing steering committee, and as soon as there are elections, they would take over. The elected members would take over. It's also important to note that a majority of 75% of voting directors will be needed to change the grocery code. So we wanted to make sure that any changes brought to the code are clearly pass an appropriate threshold. So we're proposing the GCAO will have 5 main roles. And first is training and education of members. And the expectation is that there will be a heavy emphasis on that, certainly in the first year of operation and perhaps more. Second is reporting and accountability to members. So regular annual reports on the status of the code and issues raised, et cetera. And this is consistent with other codes in other countries. Review of issues and ensuring compliance through various tools, including members' discipline via corrective measures, managing the dispute resolution process between 2 members, and maintaining a code that is responsive and relevant to current industry trends. So it's not a static document. It will change over time. We don't expect we've got it right or 100% right at this point in time. As I mentioned, I wanted to come back to a few key provisions, again, because they were central to some of the more contentious issues that were identified in the FPT working group report. And again, I don't want to by any means diminish the value of the other provisions in the code, because there are many and they are all important, but there were a few key ones here I think that were important to cover. The first is in section 1 under fair and ethical dealing, no punitive and vexatious acts. And that speaks to the parties to the code may not alter contracts unilaterally. It just makes it very clear that it takes the agreement of both parties to an agreement to alter a contract, and that no changes can be made by one party on its own. The second is on commercial agreements, and there's also an important stipulation there that no party shall design an agreement to explicitly work around or willfully disregard the provisions of the code, and no party may waive any of its rights or obligations under the code. And I think that's an important concept as well, because there have been there's fear among some of the smaller players that they have no control over their dealings with larger entities. And that, by the way, that works whether you're a small supplier working with a large retailer, or potentially a small retailer working with a large supplier. So again, that's part of the reason why we've got a reciprocal arrangement here in this code. Again, sticking with a few of the key provisions under the payments section. So, and this, again, this first section is on payments for programs. So these are programs that you are familiar with, such as stocking, listing, positioning, promotions, marketing costs, unsellables, etc. So, and here, you'll see that in section 3.4, that the retailer will need to provide reasonable substantiation and in sufficient detail and in an effective format for verification of the deduction or invoice. So it simply means that if you're taking deductions for these programs that you have negotiated in your agreements, it needs to be clear when you're taking it, how you're taking it, what's the detail, and in a format that's not so complex that you need to hire somebody to figure out what you're getting. The second piece is allow the party the ability to dispute the charge within the applicable period set out in the agreement. And that dispute shall be resolved as practically as possible, or as soon as practically possible. And thirdly, it also gives the other party the right to go through an internal escalation dispute resolution process and provide a contact for that process. So we are requiring that organizations identify that point of contact. In some cases, it may be a more complex system than others, but that in every case, there needs to be a contact person who is known to the other party. Continue on with payments, and this is for the non-compliance. In other words, again, you can read fines here, at least that's the way it's generally understood. So similar provisions in here as well, with an additional requirement here as well. If a party disputes the charge, or challenges the charge, the retailer shall not deduct the disputed sum from the supplier's trading account or otherwise from money owed to the supplier for goods supplied until the challenge is resolved. And again, there's the right to, or there is you must provide the opportunity for the party to go through an internal escalation dispute resolution process and to provide that contact. So again, going back to that principle of, you need to be able, we think you can, in most cases, you can resolve the dispute yourselves. That's what we're looking for here as a first step. I'm going to continue on. Under the other items, and I think this is an important element as well, this speaks to a retailer preparing forecasts in good faith, taking into consideration lead time for the supplier and with due care and consultation with the supplier. The retailer will then prepare its orders in good faith with consideration of applicable forecasts. So if you've done your forecasting together, you've signed off on that. Hopefully the orders come in aligned with that. The parties here again are encouraged to document their order and acceptance policies to make sure that you're clear in terms of what those orders are, minimum quantities, an increase or decrease in demand, and communication of those protocols and how orders are to be partially or fully accepted or rejected. So document what those protocols are is what's being proposed here. In 4.4, there's no obligation for a supplier to accept an order. And where the supplier does not accept the order, the retailer shall not impose fines or penalties on that supplier solely as a result of the supplier failing to deliver the quantities in the non-accepted order. So that, again, that's a non-accepted order. If on the other hand, the supplier has accepted the order and then doesn't deliver, then they're clearly subject to whatever the associated payment would be. As well in here, where the retailer orders materially less than planned forecasts, resulting in financial implications for the supplier, then we're asking the retailers to work reasonably with the supplier on mitigation strategies. And then finally, where the total demand for a product exceeds available supply, suppliers will take into consideration all existing and requested orders from all retailers. So it's just, we're not asking the suppliers to do any kind of mental gymnastics here, but certainly take into consideration what their total orders are. Again, in circumstances where supply or where demand exceeds supply. So where are we now in the process? The proposed provisions of the code have been developed. The GCAO and governance model has also been completed in terms of the proposals. So we're now moving into an education and consultation phase for the next 30 days. So this is a first presentation. I suspect that some of the organizations, certainly that have been members of the steering committee, have begun their own presentations to participating organizations. And you'll find, as I say, much more information on the consultation website. Following the consultation period, the steering committee and the industry subworking group will meet to make any adjustments to the code they feel are necessary based on their review of the input received through the consultation process. Once the code has been, so that's, you can see there, that's the May piece is the industry education and consultation period. Finalization of the code based on the input. So that's where the steering committee and the industry working group will come together. And then following that, once it's finalized, the steering committee will then begin to establish the office of the adjudicator and begin implementation. Now, you can see down below their need for speed, 18-month operational review and fitting governance model. So it's important to note that there is a desire to move quickly. We're not going to get everything right the first time. But for that reason, there is a planned review after 18 months of operation. So we built that into the process. We want to see, how well this works, and then do a review fairly quickly after its implementation. Now, how do you participate? So, and you'll see this in the consultation document. It's at the conclusion of the document. It's important for the steering committee to understand those areas of the code, one, where you require more information or clarity. So once you've read through that, if you've got questions, and it's important to note that there are FAQs on the website as well. Also, they want to understand those areas that are greatest value to you. And this is important because often we know, it's human nature. We will find everything that's wrong with something. That's just where our heads go. The steering committee wants, and the working group want to know, what are those items that you feel are of greatest value? So please don't ignore that. And then thirdly, is there anything substantive that we have missed? We don't think so. We had good representation. We think we've covered the elements, but if there is something substantive that we've missed, we need to hear from you on that as well. So these are the questions we're asking you to respond to. And we're asking you to be as specific as possible. So please identify those elements of the code where you need more information or clarification. Please identify those elements of the code that are most important or greatest value to you. So again, these are the specific questions. And then thirdly, is the intention to conduct a full review of the code 18 months from its implementation? So I mentioned that already. Is there anything substantive and fundamental in nature that we should consider prior to implementation, recognizing that the code will be subject to review 18 months from implementation. And if so, please specify below. So you'll see that there is an input screen there as well to provide that input. Important note here, in the invitation to this webinar that we sent out, the link was to canadacode.com. We found out yesterday that the website designer, for some reason, could not use .com, so it's gone to .org. We will send out to all of you who joined us today an email message with this corrected website address, as well as those that we sent in invitations to. And we would invite you to send that to anyone else that you may have forwarded the messages to. But I just want to make sure that it's clear that this is and that site is active now. So if you click onto it, you will land on the site and you'll see what's there. It will provide you access to the consultation document, and you can provide input directly to the site. It will also give you access to a list of frequently asked questions. You can also ask questions or provide submissions through the contact tab on the consultation site. So we're not doing questions and answers here today. There are just an awful lot of you on the line, but there are a set of frequently asked questions there. If you pose additional questions, that we will likely be responding through that FAQ section. So it'll continue to build that FAQ section as well. And the site, by the way, is designed to anonymize the input received, which will be collated and then summarized by a third party, an independent third party, to bring to the steering committee and industry working group for consideration. So again, if you're concerned about anonymity, then we just want to make sure that you can rest assured that your input will be anonymized. Now, we will be asking you to identify, which voice you're speaking from, so to speak. Are you a manufacturer, large, small? Are you a primary producer? So we've got a number of categories, but we're not asking you to identify yourself specifically, but just the category, the stakeholder grouping that you're responding from. And that is it for today. And we had booked an hour, but I'm giving you back about 50 minutes of time. So with that, I want to thank all of you again. Just a reminder that we will send out in a thank you note